All right, so you sent some interesting stuff my way about how to connect faith with the community. So we're diving into a sermon today from a church in Gothenburg, Sweden.
Wow.
And they're calling their members to be gospelers, which I got to say, sounds kind of vintage. But stick with me here because their challenge is anything but outdated.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this church is framing the conversation. They're about to kick off 2 whole sermon series, all focused on bridging the gap between faith and their city. They're even planning to hit the streets and interview people, asking, if you met God, what questions would you ask him?
Talk about stepping outside the church walls.
Okay, I'm hooked. And it sounds like this sermon dives right into the deep end
Yeah.
with this gospeler idea. Where are they going with that?
Well, they start by unpacking this concept called the Great Commission. You've probably heard of it, but they're giving it a fresh perspective. See, traditionally, a lot of churches have placed the burden of evangelism solely on the shoulders of the pastor.
But this sermon flips that script, emphasizing that it's a shared responsibility for all Christians.
So it's not just about the pastor preaching from the pulpit. It's about, everyday people like you and me actually living out our faith in a way that invites conversation. I like where they're going with this.
Exactly. They even use this analogy. They say evangelism is like fishing. You can't just sit there in the boat and expect the fish to jump in.
Right.
You have to be intentional. Go where the fish are and use the right bait.
Okay, I get it. Be proactive, engage with people. But fishing, really, that feels a little, how do I put this delicately?
Dated.
I hear you. It definitely conjures up some old school imagery, but I think the core message is relevant. We need to be thoughtful and intentional about how we communicate our faith. And that leads them to their next point, where they outline 4 key principles for effective communication, using the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman.
The Samaritan woman at the well, that's classic Sunday school stuff. How are they finding something fresh to say about that? Well, they use this familiar story to highlight 4 principles for engaging with others about faith. First, they talk about crossing boundaries. Jesus crossed all kinds of social and cultural boundaries by speaking to this woman. She was a Samaritan woman and considered a sinner, someone completely outside of his social circle.
So what kinds of boundaries are they challenging us to cross today? It's not like we're dealing with Samaritans on every corner.
Right, but think about the divisions and assumptions we encounter in our own lives. Political differences, socioeconomic gaps, cultural misunderstandings, maybe even within our own families or friend groups. Are we willing to step outside our comfort zones, engage with people who are different from us, and build those bridges?
That's a challenge I think we all face in some way. It's easy to stay in our own echo chambers. Okay, so crossing boundaries is the first principle. What's next?
The second principle they highlight is being gracious. It's about approaching others with genuine love and concern, regardless of their background, beliefs, or even how they might have treated us in the past. They really challenge us to examine our own hearts and ask, do we have love for everyone? Do we extend grace even to those who don't seem to deserve it?
That's powerful. It's easy to talk about loving our neighbor, but are we willing to put it into action, even when it's hard?
And the sermon gives some very specific examples to really make us think, like encountering a struggling teenage mother or a homeless person. Do we show them compassion? Do we treat them with dignity, or do we turn away? These questions force us to confront our own biases and preconceived notions.
So crossing boundaries and being gracious, I'm starting to see how these principles are all about creating genuine connection, not just preaching at people. What's the third principle?
The third principle is initiating conversations. Don't wait for others to come to you. Take the first step. The sermon encourages us to introduce ourselves, find common ground, meet a need, or simply offer a listening ear.
So being proactive, stepping out of our comfort zones, and initiating conversations. That's a lot to process. What's their fourth and final principle?
This one gets to the heart of the matter. Knowing your message. You don't have to be a theological expert, but you should be able to articulate the core truths of your faith in a way that makes sense to others. And it goes beyond just rattling off doctrines or verses. It's about sharing from a place of personal conviction and experience.
So reflecting on what our faith truly means to us, how it shapes our values and actions, and then finding ways to share that authentically with others. That's a challenge, but it's also exciting.
Exactly. And it ties back to their overall message about being a gospeler. It's not about shoving your beliefs down anyone's throat. It's about living out your faith in a way that's both genuine and inviting. And that can look different for everyone.
This is really making me think about my own approach to sharing my faith. I'm starting to see how gospeler isn't just an outdated term. It's an invitation to engage in a much deeper and more authentic way.
And you know, it's interesting. Despite all this talk about principles and techniques, the sermon actually closes with a very important reminder.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the takeaway?
It's not about the method, but the message. That ultimately matters. The message of the cross, the message of grace and redemption. That's the heart of it all.
So it's not about having the perfect elevator pitch or winning arguments. It's about sharing a message of hope and love. That resonates with the human heart. I love that. But how does this church actually put all this into practice? They mentioned something about going out into the city, right? I'm curious to hear more about their approach.
That's where it gets really interesting. They're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. Remember their plan to interview people on the streets?
Yeah.
That's just one example of how they're actively engaging with their community. They're stepping outside the church walls and taking the initiative to start conversations.
So instead of waiting for people to walk through their doors, they're going out and meeting people where they are. That's a bold move.
Absolutely. They're creating opportunities for dialogue and understanding.
Yeah.
And the question they're asking, if you met God, what would you ask him? Is brilliant. It's open-ended, non-threatening, and it invites people to share their deepest thoughts and questions.
Yeah, I can already imagine the kinds of conversations that'll spark. It's about genuine curiosity, not just trying to convert people.
Exactly. It's about building relationships and fostering a sense of connection. And remember that emphasis on knowing your message. Well, they're putting that into practice as well. They're not just sharing vague platitudes. They're diving into the core truths of their faith and explaining them in a way that's relevant and accessible.
So they're actually living out these principles themselves. They're not just preaching them from a pulpit. They're modeling what it means to be a gospeler in the 21st century.
And I think that's a powerful example for all of us, regardless of our individual beliefs or backgrounds. It's a reminder that we can all make a difference by simply being willing to engage with others in a respectful and authentic way.
I love that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the Great Commission, the 4 principles of communicating faith, and even the somewhat controversial analogy of fishing for souls. But as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's time to bring it back to you, the listener.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this whole concept of being a gospeler. What does that term even evoke for you? Does it feel outdated, inspiring, intimidating?
And how do you see yourself fitting into this idea of sharing your faith, whatever that may look like for you? The big question, but I think it's one worth pondering.
So we've explored some really thought-provoking ideas, about communicating faith. And it all circles back to this whole idea of being a gospeler in today's world.
Yeah, that term really stuck with me, I'll admit. Initially, I thought gospeler sounded a bit, dusty. But as we've unpacked this sermon, it's taken on a whole new meaning for me.
Absolutely. It's not about being preachy or pushy. It's about authenticity, genuine connection, and sharing that message of hope. That resonates with the human heart.
Right. It's about those quiet acts of kindness, those heartfelt conversations, those moments where our faith just kind of shines through in unexpected ways.
And I love how this church in Gothenburg is taking such an innovative approach. They're not afraid to go out into their community, ask questions, and listen to what people are really thinking and feeling.
They're meeting people where they are without judgment or pretense. And they're showing that faith isn't just about Sunday sermons, it's about everyday living.
That brings us back to the heart of this whole deep dive. How do we as individuals embody this idea of being a gospeler in our own unique ways?
It's a personal journey for sure, but I think this sermon offers some really valuable insights. It's about crossing boundaries, showing grace, initiating conversations, and knowing our message.
And remembering that it's not about perfection. It's about authenticity. It's about sharing our faith in a way that feels genuine and true to who we are.
So as you go out into the world, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep sharing the message. That matters. It might be a simple act of kindness, a listening ear, or a heartfelt conversation.
And who knows, maybe through our efforts, we might even inspire others to become gospelers in their own unique ways.
What a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep seeking, keep sharing, and keep the conversation going.